All right. So with the sequel, The Amazing Spider-Man 2, coming out actually today, I decided to kind of a spur of the moment thing. I decided to rent the video game adaptation, which shares the same title. It's from a developer called Beenox, at, which has been developing Spider-Man games for a few years now. And basically the reasoning behind this rental is was basically because I really wanted to see where Spider-Man games had come, because when it comes to Spider-Man games, I jumped ship after Web of Shadows, which was horrible. That game was all kinds of bad. I mean, from the voice acting to the characters to the very repetitive gameplay. But I'm not going to get into that. So I wanted to check in on the Spider-Man game market, see if anything had improved. And upon playing this, I went into it with a pretty open mind. I mean, I think movie licensed games, or at least some of them, can actually be okay if actual effort is put into them. Like the X-Men Origins Wolverine game, that was pretty good, or at least I thought so. I mean, there wasn't really a whole lot past single player to really engage in, but the single player was at least worth a rental, um, just for the sheer joy of a very gory Wolverine experience. I mean, at least that developer got the character. And even Deadpool, the developer got the character. It's just I think really wanted something more out of the out of a game adaptation of Deadpool rather than just a hack and slash. Just a very linear hack and slash that was basically almost bare bones in terms of extra content. But I digress. The Amazing Spider-Man 2 continues presumably continues what was established in Amazing Spider-Man 1 in that it returns to the open world formula that Spider-Man games had basically become accustomed to before switching to a more linear format with Shattered Dimensions and Edge of Time, which I never actually played. I heard at least Shattered Dimensions was okay. Edge of Time I didn't hear too many good things about, but seeing that it was a new developer and they didn't really seem to be overstretching themselves like they did with Web of Shadows, and seeing how it has been 6 years since Web of Shadows, 5 or 6 years, I was willing to give this one a chance, and to my disappointment, it's just serviceable. I mean, it is the kindest thing I can say about this is that it is moderately playable. Okay, so this actually makes the interesting move not to follow either one of the movies. It uses the style of the movies, and even some of the character models basically mirror their movie counterparts. Like Electro looks just like, or looks like Jamie Foxx. I don't want to say just like. Um, Harry Osborn looks just like Dane DeHaan from the movie, which I will probably end up seeing sometime soon. So so in that sense, it's kind of like the movie, and even the costume. The costume is like the second movie at least, but it kind of crafts its own story using some characters from the movie and some comic book characters that they've basically redone in the style of the movie. So honestly, the story was okay. I mean, it would never work in a movie. I mean, it's completely overstuffed with Spider-Man bad guys to ever work on screen. But as a game plot, I've seen worse, and I've seen worse Spider-Man plots. So as far as the story goes, I actually thought it was okay. I mean, I like the fact that it didn't follow the movie. So even if I had seen the movie, I wouldn't really know what was going on. Um, I wouldn't be able to say, okay, this is where I fight so and so. Okay, this is where I break into so and so, because if you're not following the movie, then you really can't make any predictions like that. So yeah, the story was okay. I couldn't really tell where it was going. They seemed to tie the villains in relatively well. I mean, you felt like each villain had a reason to be there. It wasn't a great reason, but they did provide reasoning to where I was like, oh, okay, I get why Kraven the Hunter is here. I get why the Kingpin is here. I get why he is involved. Blah 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 blah. But where this game really falls apart is actually in several areas. First of all, they found a way to complicate what I didn't even know could be complicated, which is getting around as Spider-Man, basically navigating New York. I'm sorry. Okay, basically how you control Spider-Man in the open world anyway is pushing. I'm using the PlayStation controls. You push the R2 button to shoot a web with his right hand, and the L2 button to shoot web with his left hand. Now you're meant to alternate, but honestly, you could just play the entire game shooting webs out of one hand. Now, again, this kind of overcomplicates things in that you don't need two separate buttons for essentially the same function. I know what they were going for in that they wanted to make players feel like they had more control, but there's a difference between giving players more control over a character and, like I said, overcomplicating it. What was wrong with the simple method of just pushing, again, I'm going by the PS2 controls, just pushing R2 to web swing? I mean, I've heard a lot of good things. I actually played Spider-Man 2. Spider-Man 2, a game that at this point is 10 years old, handles web swinging and getting around to Spider-Man much more smoothly than this. And I'll elaborate more on that right now. The second method that you're expected to use is Web Rush, I think it's called, where you basically push R1 and Spider-Man randomly picks a point that he will basically zip towards, and it's meant to be a faster method of travel. Again, something that was okay. Now, by holding the R1 button, you go into this kind of slow-mo. You kind of go into this slow motion sort of routine where you can actually, in slow motion, you can actually pick from several points near you where you can actually zip to. Now, you could do that, which is actually the preferable method if you want to web rush, because if you try to just tap R1, then Spider-Man will just randomly pick a point, and it may or may not be in the direction that you want to go. Now again, something that was much simpler in Spider-Man 2, even Spider-Man 3, and Ultimate Spider-Man. 3 games where that maneuver was much, much simpler. Where I believe you just push the 2 shoulder buttons at the same time and you kind of zipped forward. Why did they have to make it so? Again, I realize what they're trying to do. They're trying to give the player control over where they want to go. If you want to, I don't know, attach to a flagpole, then you can actually go to that exact point, that exact flagpole. But again, should that really come at the cost of completely breaking the flow of web swinging? I mean, when you're web swinging in any one of these games, you don't really want to break the flow. You don't want to stop, because it is fun. And in this game, it's fun, despite the despite the shoulder button overcomplication. But with this web rush thing being one of your primary modes of transportation, and again, a lot of the buildings are so tall that if you want to get around something, you can either choose to swing around a building, or you can choose to web rush toward. You can choose to web rush over top of several buildings, over top an entire block. But the thing is, you obviously don't want to just tap R1 because, again, that could send you off in any direction, any unpredictable direction. Or you can hold down R1 and go into that slow-mo thing. But again, that breaks the flow, but you don't want to do it, but at the same time you kind of have to if you want to get any use whatsoever out of this web rush. And web rush also functions as a way to attack your enemies. Like you target the enemies and then push R2, or you hold down R2, target the enemies with the web rush, and then he zips towards them and kicks them. Again, this is so. In fact, R1 is used for much more than that. It's used in the stealth sections, these god-awful stealth sections. Oh my god. You thought the stealth sections in Castlevania 2 were bad? You know, at least those were over and done with. At least those were easy. At least those were painless. Or at least most of them were. The rat sections in Castlevania Lords of Shadow 2, they were pretty painless. I mean, you obviously didn't like doing them, but you didn't really have that much trouble with them. Once you figure out the method, then you could. Once you figured out the singular method that you needed to do to get past the area, then you would just do that method. But here the stealth sections are just so awkward. They control so awkward, and here's where this game really. This is where this game is fundamentally flawed in terms of how it plays. It tries to be a Batman Arkham game. It does. In fact, this whole game, it seems like they're trying to make Spider-Man into Batman. Stop it. Because the story, I know I'm kind of jumping around here, but throughout the story, even though the story itself is good, the characterization is all over the place, especially on Spider-Man. Because a recurring theme in this is Spider-Man not wanting to cross that line and kill someone. When has that ever become a problem that he has had to deal with? At least in movies or games. Usually that concept of not killing someone is associated with the character of Batman. Someone who actually comes much closer to crossing the line than Spider-Man. Spider-Man is supposed to be this happy, jokey, friendly neighborhood Spider-Man, and he's talking about possibly killing people. So again, that's one aspect of Batman that they try to incorporate into Spider-Man, and it just feels out of place. And another aspect is the gameplay. Combat. Whenever you're engaging groups of enemies, it deliberately copies the free flow combat from the Batman Arkham games. You know, where you push a single button to attack, and then whenever someone's about to hit you, you push the counter button and you hit them. But the thing is, they handle it so poorly here, because it does not feel nearly as fluid. I mean, Spider-Man jumping from bad guy to bad guy does not feel nearly as fluid. It feels so stilted. It feels stiff. You just feel like it feels like a 2D beat 'em up, the way that these feel, and it's a 3D open world game, and the way that Spider-Man moves, and the way that he deliberately almost locks in place when he's just punching someone. It feels like a 2D beat 'em up, whereas Batman, he was always moving. The flow was constant, assuming you were skilled enough. Batman required skill. And Batman, the system was good enough and designed well enough that it worked. But here, not only does it feel stilted, but the camera hates you. The camera is so bad. The only reason I died so much on this game, especially in the hand-to-hand combat sections, was because the camera did not was because they designed the camera not to focus on whichever enemy is hitting me. Again, in the Batman Arkham games, whenever someone was about to hit you, you could clearly see when they were about to hit you because the camera panned back enough to where you could get a clear picture of the entire battlefield. Here, the camera always stays so close to Spider-Man that if some guy is about to hit you off camera, then you can't see him coming. Sure, Spidey's spider sense goes off, but that brings me to another problem, and that a lot of the time I hit the counter button, but I apparently did not react fast enough. And again, when I see Spidey's spider sense going off and I don't see any enemies on screen, it's just weird. It feels so awkward. The enemies are not on screen when they're trying to hit you half the time. So basically, what a lot of combat encounters boil down to is fighting the camera just as much as you're fighting the enemies. And when you die, it feels like a cheat because you feel like the game was not designed well enough to where you could play as well as you know you could have. Because like I said, the camera is way too zoomed in, and that's also a problem with the web swinging. At least in the past Spider-Man games, even Web of Shadows knew this. Web of Shadows knew that it... And again, I understand what they were trying to do. They were trying to emphasize the feeling of momentum and really being right there with Spider-Man as he swings. But the thing is, zooming the camera in so much on Spider-Man as he is swinging, or not just as he is swinging, all the time, doesn't really let you get a clear picture of your surroundings. I mean, you might bump into a building, you might accidentally run into a street crime that you didn't necessarily want to engage in at the time because you couldn't really see it. I just had such a problem with the camera in this game. I mean, it just seems so poorly designed. In a Spider-Man game, Spider-Man is supposed to be this very mobile superhero, this very kinetic style superhero, and when the camera can't keep up with him, then you have a fundamental problem in design that's surely going to affect your gameplay. What else? Well, going back to the stealth sections, again, the camera is one of the recurring problems here because okay, again, I have to compare these to the Batman Arkham games because that's what they were going for, but again, who said Spider-Man needed stealth? Who said? Who said we needed to make this a main part of the story where you had to sneak around and silently take guys down? Why should that be a main character of Spider-Man? It shouldn't. But they don't care. They're just trying to copy off Batman. Because Batman, the Arkham games are popular. The Arkham games have been hailed, rightfully so, as the greatest comic book movie or comic book games ever made. So what we're getting now is a bunch of copycats. Because I remember a few years back, Captain America tried the same thing with that movie tie-in game to the first Captain America movie. So, but I digress. These stealth sections, you know, in the Batman Arkham games, the Invisible Predator segments where you had a multitude of options from which to tackle the scenario. I mean, you didn't just... The best way I can describe this is that imagine you could only swing on gargoyles. You couldn't go into vents. You couldn't hide around corners. You couldn't do anything. You couldn't crouch. Imagine you could only go on the gargoyles and or whatever rooftops or whatever roofs of small buildings that were in the area. And imagine you can only do silent takedowns. That's basically what these stealth sections in The Amazing Spider-Man 2 amount to. They are so boring. They are so boring, and again, poorly designed. They are so poorly designed because again, your spider sense is used like detective vision. Again, copying. But your spider sense is used as detective vision. But the thing is, it doesn't necessarily differentiate between guys with guns and guys without guns. You actually have to switch out of spider sense and maybe zoom in with your camera to find out if someone has guns. Why can't? I mean, if Spider-Man is supposed to use his spider sense, why can't? If you're basically having spider sense substitute for detective vision, then have it substitute for detective vision instead of just making it look like detective vision. I mean, have it be able to differentiate between guys with guns. All of them just look red. All of them are just these holographic red figures when you go into spider sense. You can't tell which ones have guns and which ones have standard melee weapons like baseball bats. And again, the camera is fighting you again because when you zip to the ceiling again using the R1, one of the only methods you can do to ensure precisely where you want to go, you have to hold down the R1 button and go into that slow-mo thing. But if you zip to the ceiling, the camera stays right side up from Spider-Man's perspective. So basically what happens is that the whole room, to you anyway, is upside down. So it leaves you completely disoriented. I mean, they had to try to find a better way to implement this. I mean, I know Spider-Man you have to embrace the verticality of Spider-Man, because you never saw Batman doing anything like this. But you had to have found a better way. Maybe make Spider-Man upside down and make the rest of the room right side up. Instead of completely disorienting the players again. And again, too zoomed in. The camera is way too zoomed in. You can't get a clear picture of the entire room. Even when you go to the topmost ceiling and kind of hang down on a web. Even when you do that, it's difficult to get a clear picture of the room, and since there are no other methods of taking down enemies besides silent takedowns, you feel you feel obviously much more limited in your options, and B, it takes longer to take these guys down without getting spotted. What I ended up doing eventually, after losing my patience, is to just jump down, melee them, and whenever I saw a guy with a gun, I would pull his gun away and web it to the floor with the upgrade system. The upgrade system is pretty limited. It's pretty easy to level something up to the max because there's only like 3 levels. Like, you can level up your web grab, you can level up your web swing. I mean, it's extremely easy to get to full power, especially if you're just playing through the story missions, because the story missions give you so many experience points. The story itself took me about 4 to 6 hours to complete, so not exactly the lengthiest experience, especially given it's an open world game. I mean, usually you expect those to be longer. The stealth sections are horrible. The web swinging is okay. I still like to web swing, despite the fact that I now have to use 2 shoulder buttons, or the game tries to encourage me to use both shoulder buttons to web swing. Web swinging is still fun. Spider-Man looks pretty good when he's web swinging. I mean, in terms of his motions and whatever. I mean, I like the little poses that he does. I mean, you can tell that. I mean, that shows an attention to detail when it seems like every other time Spider-Man comes up, he's doing a different pose. So at least there was that attention to detail, and that part of the character they got right. The voice acting is kind of hit or miss. I mean, it ranges from okay to god-awful. I don't know any of the voice actors' names, or I know some of them. Um, Spider-Man is voiced by some guy named Sam Riegel, who apparently voiced him in The Amazing Spider-Man 1. He's okay. I mean, he doesn't really give a horrible performance, but honestly, he was kind of miscast. Because he doesn't really have a whole lot of vocal range. I mean, whenever he's trying to sound sad, it's doesn't really sound too dissimilar to when he sounds surprised or when he sounds happy or whatever. I mean, he doesn't really have a whole lot of vocal range that I think is necessary for a dynamic character like Spider-Man. But also, he's kind of bland. I mean, his voice just sounds kind of bland and generic. Again, he's not charismatic. Um, because even the Spider-Man voices I didn't like. Um, Again, going back to Web of Shadows, at least that Spider-Man, despite having an annoying voice, actually had some range to said annoying voice. Rino Romano in the PS1 Spider-Man games had charisma. He had vocal range. This guy, Sam Riegel, he like I said, he's not terrible, but he's nothing special either. I mean, I would not choose him over a lot of the other Spider-Mans. I would not choose him. Like I said, he doesn't really bring much new to the character. I mean, his quips occasionally made me chuckle, but again, he delivers them with so little charisma. He's trying, but it just doesn't work out for him. The best performance in the game actually comes from Steve Blum as Kraven the Hunter. And this may come from the fact that I believe he's voiced him before. But Steve Blum as Kraven the Hunter, they make Kraven the Hunter probably the most interesting character in the game. And I never thought that would be possible, because I've always been pretty bored with Kraven the Hunter, as a character anyway. But they make Kraven the Hunter the most interesting character in the game, and then completely pull the rug out from under you and just kind of revert him back to that's the Kraven the Hunter that's been done before, like, oh, I want to capture Spider-Man. So they actually had an interesting backstory going for him, in that he wanted to hunt down abominations of nature, like these cross-species creatures that were roaming about in New York City, and he wanted to pass his knowledge on to a protege, blah, 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 and it turns out that was all an elaborate trap. But you had an interesting backstory going for him, so I don't know why they botched that. But yeah, Kraven the Hunter, like I said, is probably the most interesting villain in the game. And Steve Blum does a good job. Although everyone else, well, there's one other decent performance, and that is Ali Hills as Black Cat. Again, not exactly my favorite Black Cat, but because my favorite Black Cat is still Jennifer Hale in the animated series and in the PS1 games. But for the most part, Ali Hills, Lightning from Final Fantasy XIII, and Liara from Mass Effect. She does a pretty good job of portraying the sultry nature of Black Cat, but she also actually does a simultaneous good job about giving her some semblance of emotional depth, in that she wants to infuse herself with this kind of cross species experiments, so that she can be with Spider-Man. So again, her performance was okay, but everyone else is horrible. Everyone else. I mean, the Kingpin is horrible. The Green Goblin / Harry Osborn, horrible. Electro, horrible. The guy who plays Carnage, terrible. Kingpin's probably the worst, though. Kingpin probably gives the worst performance in the game. And what struck me about all of these performances, even the good ones, even the decent ones, like the ones I mentioned, the three decent ones, it seemed like there was no direction given to the voiceover actors. I mean, it sounds like they were they were just kind of saying the line like like they were like they were just randomly taking a shot at the line and hoping that that's what the hoping that that's what they wanted, hoping that that's how they wanted me to say the line. I mean, I they haven't really told me anything about the situation. It's they just want me to say the line, and I am making my first pass at the line. That's what all of the voice acting sounds like. It sounds like there was absolutely no direction given to the voice actors. There was no prep, or if there was, it wasn't very confident. This so like I said, the voice acting is pretty hit or miss. The graphics are below average. They're honestly, I was shocked at how bad some of the graphics were. Spider-Man himself, the suit anyway, looks all right. The various different suits that you can unlock, they look okay. I mean, I like the fact that they actually get battle damaged, and they seem to have a nice texture going about them. And some of the buildings, at least from a distance, look okay. I mean, I didn't really notice a whole lot of pop in. And guys like and people like Black Cat, she looks okay, but everything else, all of the all of the textures, all the facial textures, and a lot of the all the textures really. I mean, the building textures, the clothing textures, the facial textures are just so muddy. They are just so undetailed. I say texture or lack thereof. I was surprised at how bad some of these character models look. I was surprised at at how sloppy some of these graphical glitches were, especially once you actually get to the symbiotes. Yeah, yeah. I'm not exactly selling this game as a positive, as a positive purchase, and it's really not. I mean, at best, it's painfully mediocre. I can see a hardcore Spider-Man fan getting a little bit more enjoyment out of this than I did, because the villains are there. You do get to fight a lot of the villains, and the story flows relatively well for a game. And some of the voice acting is okay, but a lot of the bad performances, a lot of the subpar graphics, a lot of the odd gameplay choices, a lot of the really poor design of the game really relegates it to nothing more than a 1 or 2 night rental, because there's not really a whole lot to do after the main campaign, and after the main campaign you don't exactly feel all that satisfied. There are much better Spider-Man games out there, and what pisses me off about this post campaign, post story, is that there's not really a whole lot of incentive to go out and do any of the side missions. I mean, the game tries to come up with this excuse for you to do the side missions, because there's this ranking bar, and the more side missions you do, the more of a hero you are, and if you just completely ignore the side missions, then you become more and more of a menace. But and if you let it drop into the menace bar, then the Kingpin's task force comes after you. But not only does this task force barely come into play in the main story, or at least in a meaningful way, it barely comes into play, but also it's they are nothing that can't be easily overcome. I mean, threatening the player with a few extra enemies in the form of the task force soldiers is not really any worthwhile incentive to do your painfully average side quests. I mean, the side quests just amount to street crimes, like saving someone from a fire, beating up X number of guys, doing the occasional race, and collecting a bunch of comic books and other collectibles. I'm sorry. In this day and age, when the open world game market has almost become saturated, because there's so many games out there in that genre. You need to come up with something more than this. You need to come up with worthwhile side missions with a lot more depth. How about coming up with a series of side missions or several series of side missions where which actually lead to confrontations with different Spider-Man villains not seen in the main game? Something like the Batman Arkham series, something like or something like any number of Rockstar's games, like Grand Theft Auto, Red Dead, LA Noire. The side missions in those actually had depth. They actually felt like their own little narrative. And if you're just resorting to that old formula of like, oh, after you completed the main story, you can collect X number of tokens, or go and do X number of races, or do X number of street crimes, and you'll get some snazzy new outfits. If you're just resorting to that, which is a formula that has basically become obsolete in the realm of open world games, then I don't really know how to recommend this as anything other than an overnight rental. Like I said, it didn't take me very long to beat the main story, and I don't really feel any biting need to go back and do any of the side quests. So this is really only a rental for Spider-Man fans. That's basically this review in a nutshell. A rental for Spider-Man fans. And even then, I could think of many different Spider-Man games that are more worthy of your money. Like Spider-Man 2, again, a game that is 10 years old but is better than this. Even Spider-Man 1 from 2002, based on the first Tobey Maguire movie. That's better. Shattered Dimensions, I've heard, is better, and Shattered Dimensions, I think anyway, is also by Beenox. And to this day, the best Spider-Man game I have played, or at least the one that brought me the most enjoyment, even though from a design perspective it is pretty old school, is actually the first Spider-Man game on the PS1. You know, the one I was mentioning with Reno Romano? And it basically revolves around stopping this symbiote plot. It's very comic booky, but it got the character of Spider-Man more. It didn't try to turn him into Batman. It didn't include any of these stupid stealth sections. Yeah, the graphics are crap by today's standards, but again, it has more charm to it than this. The narrative is more engaging than this. The characters are more likable than this. The characters are more fleshed out than this. So, yeah, if you really need your Spider-Man fix, and really need a recent game through which to roleplay once again as Spider-Man, even though there are numerous other Spider-Man open world games, I would say rent this, I guess, or even better, rent Lego Marvel Superheroes.